Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Democracy of Discord, posted by New Enders Gov, and they said, tired of servers where admins control everything. We'll join a server around debates, free speech, and democracy. You can run for office, debate policy, or just watch everything unfold. What we offer, monthly election where you can be a member of the council, which is both legislature and executive, debate about politics, religion, economics, philosophy, and much more of daily debate prompts, independent judiciary where most moderation actions require judicial confirmation, a system where moderators, admins, and even the owner are accountable to the government, freedom of speech where all ideologies are welcome and you cannot be suppressed, active chats, movie nights, game nights, giveaways, general activities, and much more. Whether you are a future council person, a master debater, or just want to hang out with the community, there's a place for you here, and they link to the Discord server. And yeah, personally, that sounds kind of good. I personally am not really, don't use Discord too much. It kind of makes Reddit look like a good platform if you ask me. But regardless, if people if they want to have their own Discord server with their own rules, I think they should be able to. Ultimately, if I think people, if they want to have any internet property with their own rules, they should be able to. But ultimately, it does come down to what the platform owner thinks. In the case of Reddit, Discord, YouTube, Twitter, or whatever platform you're using, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Feds attack Second Amendment expression of transgender people will laying groundwork for potential trans firearm registry from MSN.com, posted by Don't Reply to This Account. Those across was from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. Yeah, personally, I'll be against that. I don't think the government should have any registries, but, the government is going to have some registries, like the sex offender registry or the census for that matter. And yeah, personally, I think I'm sure if the registry was all of MAGA people, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever, but since it's of the in-group trans people rather than the out-group MAGA people, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. Reddit, it's interesting, they're very pro-gun control a lot of the time, especially when it comes to red flag laws and all that. But suddenly you say, what about for transgender people? To say you can't take away transgender guns from transgender people and other minorities. That's fascism. It just goes to say they have no principles. They want all the in-group to be armed, while all the out-group to be disarmed. No principles, only teams. And that just goes to say, I'm sure if it was Christians or white people getting disarmed, right, I think it's the greatest thing ever, since those are more out-group coded than in-group coded. But, since it's transgender people, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever that there's a transgender firearm registry. No principles, only teams. It's like, they call Trump Hitler, but then they say, oh, we need sensible gun control. It's like Trump's Hitler, but we need to ban guns. They have no principles. They'll follow whatever the narrative is. They're almost incapable of thinking for themselves a lot of the time. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have period, posted by Mazda Prophet, and that was like a screenshot of a quote from Malcolm X. Only a fool would let his enemy teach his children, Malcolm X. And I'd agree with that. Personally, I don't agree with everything Malcolm X said, but this is definitely true. A lot of education these days is simply indoctrination, and that's why I think, people should be focused on more homeschooling if they're able to, rather than just putting their kids in government-run schools. Private-run schools might be slightly better than government-run schools, but still, you don't really know what's happening at school 24/7. They could be even in the more conservative schools. Teachers tend to be by and large on the progressive side, and regardless of what school they're at, you could be in the middle of one of the most conservative states in Oklahoma, and the teacher could be a woke Reddit gender goblin, and I think that's important to remember as well. So ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is you want to send your kids to public school, private school, or homeschool, just by doing whatever you want to, but ultimately, all education is going to be indoctrination to a certain degree, and I think that's going to be important to remember as well. Next we have Daddy Government told us their COVID shot saved millions of lives. That's their justification for their tyranny. It's a lie. It didn't save millions of lives. Posted by Mazda Prophet, and they said, send Ron Johnson just Saturday to lie that COVID shot saved 3 million lives. It's partial. In 2019, before the pandemic, there were 2.5 million annual deaths in America. The year the pandemic shot to 3.4 million. 2021 was the year of the vaccine. If the vaccine really was going to end the pandemic, you'd think we'd come back down toward that normalized baseline. We didn't. We went to 3.5 million. Next year we came down a little bit to 3.3 million, but we're still way above the normalized rates of deaths. They're claiming in this Commonwealth Fund study that vaccines saved 3 million lives in both 2021 and 2022. In order for that to be true, you'd have to assume where you were going to have 5 million deaths per year in both 2021 and 2022. I don't need a sophisticated mathematical analysis to show there's no way the injection saved 3 million lives in 2021 and 2022. And then they linked to a Twitter post, I guess I was saying that, from Jan Gilak. It said, Senator Ron Johnson sat down with me for an interview to break down the lies we were told during the COVID era. Watch the full interview below. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if you want to think the COVID shot's the greatest thing ever, you should be able to. And if you want to think it saved 3 million lives, you should be able to. If you don't think the opposite, you should be able to. If you don't think it's the worst thing ever and it didn't save any lives, you should be able to. Ultimately, the libertarian positions, if you want to think the COVID shot was the best thing ever, that's fine. If you don't think it's the worst thing ever, that's fine. If you want to take it, that's fine. If you don't want to take it, that's fine. Justify doing whatever you want to for your own body, and that's very much how libertarians work. It's your body, your choice. A lot of so-called progressives, they're extremely your body, your choice when it comes to stuff like abortion. But the second you bring up vaccines mandates, suddenly they're for them because they only care about what the narrative says. That they think you need to take the vaccine or risk imprisonment because they only care what the narrative is. They say my body, my choice, but they don't really mean it. If it's really my body, my choice, you should be for people to do whatever they want to with their own bodies, and that includes not take that vaccines if they don't want to. Next, we have your license plate might be funding an anti-LGBTQ extremist group from Uncloseted Media, posted by Nick Concussions, and they said, a lookout in Uncloseted Media investigations found that millions of dollars from various state motor vehicle departments are being funneled to far-right groups that use that money to lobby lawmakers and fund litigation that defeat equity measures for millions of people across the country, including for women, people of color, and more specifically, LGBTQ people. It's all been done through what's on the back of people's cars. In nationwide sampling of the state specialty license plates financial data since 2020, more than $7 million has gone to groups that have helped champion anti-LGBTQ legislation, funded litigation that struck down conversion therapy bans, and promoted Christian nationalist views that have direct ties to nationally recognized anti-queer groups. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for any of that, but, ultimately the government can throw money at whatever groups it wants to. I'm sure when the government throws money at progressive causes, people like knee concussions here are silent on that, and it just goes to show you, it only matters who's in the in group, who's in the out group. If we're up to this person, we'd be all the government money would go to the woke LGBTQ groups who are trying to get as many transgender kids as possible. But, since this money's going to the out group, it's only the worst thing ever. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, if you want to earmark your money to go to a woke group or a MAGA group, earmark your money to go to whatever group you want to, but, you shouldn't be forced to pay money to a group you might not support, and I think that's very much the libertarian position there. Next we have, he was asked for a reaction, not a confession, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's for a screenshot of Trump's recent interview with Norah O'Donnell in 60 Minutes. O'Donnell said in the supposed suspected shooter's manifesto, he wrote that I'm no longer willing to permit a pedophile, a rapist, a traitor who might answer his crimes. What's your reaction? Trump, I was waiting for you to read that because I knew you would because you're horrible people. I'm not a rapist. I didn't rape anybody. I'm not a pedophile. Excuse me. You read that crap for a sick person. I was totally exonerated. You should be ashamed of yourself reading that. You're a disgrace. O'Donnell, do you think he was referring to you? And I guess they linked to a YouTube link of that segment of the interview. And yeah, personally, if this shooter wanted to call Trump a pedophile, rapist, murderer, and believe he was a pedophile, rapist, murderer, and tried to, I want to justify taking him out, ultimately, people are going to justify, ultimately, if you want to believe Trump's a pedophile or not, I don't think it really matters. I think a lot of the ruling class are pedophiles, but of course, a lot of the woke people only care that Trump might be a pedophile. They don't care that any other elected official might be a pedophile. Maybe if they have an R next to their name, but definitely not if they have a D next to their name. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, this is a both sides issue, says side that shot President Trump, assassinated Charlie Kirk, tried to assassinate Kavanaugh, tried to shoot Trump again, shot Steve Scalise, firebombed Governor Shapiro, tried to shoot Trump a third time, continued from BabylonB.com, posted by Noam Sane. And yeah, personally, the Babylon Bee, I don't agree with them on everything, they've been very Zionist recently, and that's something I personally don't really care for, but, I definitely do think, Reddit's, of course, not going to like that, whenever Reddit talks about political violence, they always say, oh, it's a right-wing problem, but, you increasingly have all these examples that it's a left-wing problem, But, ultimately, it might be a left-wing problem or a right-wing problem, but ultimately, if you use violence to get what you want, that's very unlibertarian, And I would say the biggest perpetrator of that isn't the left wing or the right wing, but the state in general. The state in general uses violence to get what they want all the time, and they just call that law. It's pirates and emperors. When an individual does something, it's a crime, but when the state does something, it's just the law. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Justice Department urges group to drop Trump ballroom lawsuit after WHCH dinner shooting from thehill.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the law subreddit. And yeah, personally, if Trump wants to use this shooting to push for his ballroom, I personally don't really care for that. But, Trump's always going to use everything to push his agenda, and that's very much the type of person he is. And, that's personally why I don't really care for people. I don't really care for people who try and push their agenda onto others. But, that seems to be a lot of people these days, especially in regards to modern American politics. Next, we have Ashley St. Clair confirmed the White House runs group chats telling these accounts what to post within minutes of shots fired tonight before there was any news of casualties and before the president said this exact talking point. This was the chat in real time, posted by Donald Key, and that was a cross post from the Weird GOP subreddit, and it looks like a bunch of MAGA influencers tweeting about how we need the White House ballroom within minutes of each other. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but if they want to collude to push narratives, they should be able to. Reddit it's completely fine when the DNC colludes to push narratives and talking points, but suddenly with the RNC does it, and suddenly it's the worst thing ever. Ultimately, people are going to push whatever narratives they want to push, and, I'm not really care for them, but, ultimately, it just goes to show you that the Reddit doesn't really have principles in this. You have tons of instances of the DNC pretty much doing the exact same thing when it comes to colluding to push narratives, but Reddit doesn't care for that because they're in the in-group rather than the out-group. When the out-group does the same thing, it's the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the left's obsession with unequal treatment before the law is something that I've been repeatedly reminded of. It's so hard to believe, posted by Mazda Prophet, and that's a screenshot of a tweet from Wall Street Man, who tweeted, Argentina President Javier Milei, being leftist is a disease of the soul. The left is built on envy, hatred, resentment, and unequal treatment under the law. They are very violent, and since they have no way or arguments to answer, they should go for physical violence at J. Milei. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the left, but the right has problems with authoritarianism as well. I think that's important to note. Ultimately, if you want to justify enforcing your beliefs on others, whether you're left, right, or center, I personally don't think that's good. A personal libertarian perspective is, if you believe whatever you want to. If you want to believe in stuff like, redistribution of wealth, that's fine. But if you use the state to enforce it, that's inherently anti-libertarian. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Germany's MERS, U.S. is being humiliated by Iran, no insight to conflict from Yahoo.com, posted by Ninja Lover. Yeah, personally, I would kind of agree with that. I do think the U.S. shouldn't have gotten involved in Iran in the first place, but, ultimately, the U.S. is probably going to be there for a while now. I don't know if we'll get boots on the ground if we haven't already, but we'll have to wait and see what happens on that front. Next, we have, if the 2028 election were held today, who do you vote for and why is it after man? Posted by Jacob Anders, and that's cross-post from the poll subreddit, and I think he posted this poll yesterday too. And yeah, personally, post whatever polls you want, I would say, but ultimately, yeah, personally, I do think Afterman's probably would be one of the better candidates, but I don't think he's going to win. The media would even regard him as a joke candidate unless he gets the major party nomination, in which case, they'll probably pull a Trump and say how he's the worst thing ever and you should vote for the other party. But regardless, I personally don't think, if voting mattered, they really wouldn't let us do it, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.